Hello, my quilty friends. Today we are making a quilt based on a Frank Lloyd Wright design called December Gifts. I first came across this design from a jigsaw puzzle. There are many things I love in this world, two of which are jigsaw puzzles and the architecture and designs of Frank Lloyd Wright. So this was a match made in heaven by having a jigsaw puzzle that was based on a Frank Lloyd Wright design, and it inspired me to create this quilt. I call this quilt Winter with Frank. And I used two of the motifs from the original design, these squares, which I am calling Block A and Block B. I have done each of these two blocks in 5 different color combinations, and I am alternating between Block A and Block B, and also rotating the blocks to create the finished design. I set the blocks with the sashing, and voila, we have a quilt. Both of the blocks only involve squares and rectangles, so it's super easy to piece. No triangles, no lost corners, easy peasy. Probably the most difficult part of this quilt is the cutting. Not that cutting those squares and rectangles is difficult, it's just that each of the 6 fabrics that are used in the quilt have multiple rectangles and squares cut from each of the fabrics, and no 2 fabrics have the same amounts of the same things. So have no fear. If you can get through the cutting, the rest of the quilt is very easy. And in the instructions, I do provide a very detailed cutting guide so that you can make the most of the fabric. One hint is that once you have all of the fabric cut, and I do recommend cutting all the fabric ahead of time, at least for the block portion. You can cut the sashing later if you get tired of cutting. But once you have all that cut, you are going to want to create your little block kits. In the instructions, I give you a chart so that you know exactly which pieces to pull to create your little block kit. Once you have all of your block kits assembled, then it is super easy to sit down and sew the blocks. You'll be making 3 of each colorway for block A and also 3 of each for block B. Now, block A, there is one block that has a little twist to it for one of the colorways, but that's all detailed in the instructions. And I managed to make all of these blocks in a relatively short time while I was away at a little, quilting retreat. Not with other people. I went to visit my artist friend, and while she was painting, I was sewing blocks together. So I got a lot done. It was great. But I brought them home and have them up on my design wall to put on the sashing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute, because the sashing is so narrow. I have a way to make it a little easier to make sure that it all lines up. So now let's get to making block A. So we're going to start with the center square, and then you sew on 2 narrow rectangles, one on each side of the square. Then you sew on 2 narrow rectangles that finish out a frame around that center square. You're now going to create a frame around the framed square, and this time you're going to use the 2.5-inch strips. You'll start by putting a shorter rectangle on each side of that framed square. And I like to make sure that I am sewing that short rectangle to the edge of the frame that is pieced. Once you have those short sides on, you'll do the long sides, and that will finish out the second frame around the square. Now for this block, we are done framing the square, and now we are going to add on, a corner frame? 2. Still using the 2.5-inch strips, we're going to sew a piece along one side of the framed square. And then we're going to sew a second piece of the same color that we just added. And this time it is going to form essentially an L. It doesn't really matter which side you sew that second piece onto for the L. It's fine. I would just recommend being consistent throughout at least that entire colorway. Once you have that first L on, we're going to add the last L. And again, you sew along one side. Make sure that it is the side of the L that has the seam. And then you sew on the last side of the L, which should nest with the previous L. More than once I sewed it to the wrong side. Little seam ripping, easy fix. And that gives you block A. So as I mentioned, there are 5 different colorways. Now, one of these colorways you will be making with 2 of the last L being in that dark purple, and the third one of that colorway will use light purple, but just for that one block. On to block B. This block starts with a larger square, and this time we are only making little L's all along the same corner of that square. You'll start with a narrow rectangle and sew that to the square. You'll then sew a narrow rectangle of the same color across either the top or the bottom. And again, it doesn't really matter as long as you are then consistent for the rest of the colorway and for the rest of the pieces. After that first L, which is in narrow strips, you will make a second L also in narrow strips, sewing to one side and then to the other. Then you have the 2.5-inch piece that goes on the side, and then the next piece forms the corner. And the very last L uses the wide strips. So you will sew that to your one side and then to the top or bottom to make that L shape. That is how you make block B. Again, there are 5 colorways of block B, and you make 3 of each colorway. There are no variations within a colorway. I've laid out half of the blocks on my design wall because the rest don't fit, but I wanted to show you how the sashing goes together. Because it's such a thin sashing, it finishes at 1 inch on the interior and at 1.5 inches on the exterior. Well, if you try to make that sashing piece its own row, a lot of times things have a hard time lining up. So the solution to that is to treat it as part of the block. This is the 3rd row of the quilt, and I have laid it out with all the different sashing pieces. So here over on the, there we go, on the end, that is a wider piece, as is this piece right here. All the other pieces are the narrow pieces, both in between and along the bottom. So I have laid out all of the sashing pieces and the little squares or rectangles along the bottom there. Now in the row above, I'm going to show you how that looks when it's put together. So the leftmost block of the row is going to be unique in that not only does it have the bottom sashing and the sashing on the left, it also needs to have the sashing piece that's on the right. So that's right here. So I simply did that by sewing sashing pieces to each side, and then I sewed the little rectangle, the sashing, and this square all together, and then once that was together, I married those to that block. So the edge blocks are a little unique in that way. All the other blocks are just going to have a side sashing and then a bottom sashing with a square. And so again, just putting those together by adding the side sashing first, then sewing the bottom sashing and square together, and then sewing those to the rest of the block. And that works for all the way. And the only difference on the far right edge block is that it has a wider sashing. The piece is cut 2 inches wide, but it's sewn on, and then the bottom sashing, and then this is a rectangle because there's 2 different measurements there, and then that gets sewn to that block. So that is what most rows are going to look like. That's what this row and the following rows will look like. The only other row that's a little different is the very first row, because of course it has sashing also at the top. And so the leftmost block is going to get sashing all the way around. And I made that one by sewing the side sashing pieces on, the wider on the left and just the regular narrow on the right side of the block. And then I sewed, in this case, a larger square in the top there, and then sashing and the rectangular piece that gets sewn to the top of the block, and then a rectangle, narrow sashing, small square at the bottom. Otherwise, all the rest of the top blocks get side sashing and then top and bottom sashing. Now the very last row will look just like the second row here, except for the fact that that bottom sashing will be the wider sashing since it's the outside. All of this is detailed in the instructions, and I have even exploded the blocks so that you can definitely see sort of how the new block is made that includes the sashing. And here again is the finished quilt. I really enjoyed designing and making this quilt. And if you would like to make a quilt just like this one, good news, there are kits available from my favorite quilt shop, Vintage Pink and Green. I will put a link in the description below and also QR code. If you are interested in just the pattern, that will be available on my Etsy store in early 2027. Thank you for joining me today, and why not check out this?